There's a quiet expectation that follows women from childhood, an invisible script written long before they ever learn to question it. It tells them to be composed, to smile even when they feel misunderstood, to soften their voice when speaking truth, and to mold their desires into something more acceptable. Over time, this script doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes identity. And what gets left behind, those raw, wild instincts, doesn't disappear. It simply retreats into shadow. Carl Jung called this hidden space the shadow self. The parts of us we disown because they feel dangerous, or because someone once told us they were wrong. Freud, decades earlier, suggested something eerily similar, that repressed desires, especially those deemed socially unacceptable, don't vanish but instead distort the way we love, the way we speak, the way we see ourselves. What if that anger you suppressed was never just anger, but a call for boundaries? What if that desire you silenced was your most honest voice, misunderstood through the lens of shame? And what if the distance you sometimes feel from yourself isn't a flaw, but a consequence of trying too hard to be good? This video is not an answer. It's an invitation to explore what society taught you to fear and what your shadow might be trying to say. Before we can understand how this shadow shapes female instinct, or why so many feel disconnected from a part of themselves, we need to understand what the shadow actually is, not just in theory, but in lived experience. What does it mean to carry a part of yourself that you don't fully know? And why does that hidden part still influence you, even in silence? To speak of the shadow is to speak of what we have exiled from ourselves, not because it is evil, but because it is inconvenient. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, described the shadow as the unconscious part of our personality that contains the traits, impulses, and desires we disown. It is not inherently negative. In fact, much of what lives in the shadow is deeply human. Anger, jealousy, sensuality, ambition, wildness, grief, all the things that don't fit into the roles we've been taught to perform. The shadow begins to form early. A child learns quickly what earns praise and what triggers withdrawal, what makes them lovable and what makes them too much. So they adapt, editing themselves in response to the emotional climate of their home, their school, their culture. And with each moment of silence, with every impulse denied, something slips beneath the surface. It doesn't vanish. It waits. Women, in particular, are conditioned to form a very specific kind of self-image, pleasing, nurturing, emotionally composed. But this image, while culturally celebrated, can only exist by suppressing its counterbalance. The woman who expresses rage is hysterical. The woman who enjoys power is cold. The woman who desires pleasure without guilt is reckless. Over time, these judgments don't just come from the outside. They are internalized. The voice of society becomes the voice in our own minds, policing not just what we do, but who we believe we are allowed to be. The paradox is that the more we suppress the shadow, the more control it has. We may think we're in charge, being mature, reasonable, morally good, but then find ourselves lashing out in ways we don't fully understand, envying people whose freedom we secretly crave, or retreating into numbness when life feels too overwhelming. These aren't failures of character. They are echoes of something deeper, the shadow asking to be seen. Jung believed that to become whole, a person must integrate the shadow, not destroy it, not cure it, but bring it into conscious awareness. This integration doesn't mean giving in to every impulse. It means being honest with ourselves about what exists within us, even when it makes us uncomfortable. Especially when it makes us uncomfortable. To say, Yes, that desire lives in me. That fear, that hunger, that fire, they are part of me too. What makes this concept so profound, particularly for women, is how it offers a path back to something that was never wrong in the first place. The shadow is not just where we hide shame, it's also where we hide vitality, the ability to speak clearly, to say no, to want something fully, to express anger without guilt, to feel pleasure without explanation. These are not indulgences. They are truths we've been taught to fear. The journey toward the shadow is never linear. It might begin with discomfort, a reaction that feels too strong, a dream that unsettles, a relationship that stirs buried feelings. But if we stay curious instead of ashamed, the shadow becomes a guide. It reveals not what's broken in us, but what has been buried. And in that excavation, we don't just discover parts of ourselves, we reclaim them. It's easy to think of repression as something personal, a quiet, private act of self-denial. But repression is often social before it becomes internal. We do not decide, in isolation, which parts of ourselves to silence. We learn through reward and rejection. We observe which emotions make us lovable and which ones provoke withdrawal. Culture, then, becomes the mirror through which we shape the mask. For women, that mirror has been particularly narrow. Across generations, feminine identity has been defined by what it restrains, not what it expresses. Goodness is measured by gentleness. Strength is expected to be quiet. Desire must be subtle, and if spoken too clearly, it is quickly reclassified as something dangerous. These messages are passed down not only through family, but through film, advertising, literature, all the subtle scripts that tell a woman what she should aspire to be. A woman's ambition, if too visible, is seen as threatening. Her anger is dismissed as overreaction. Her pleasure is questioned, moralized, or reframed through the lens of someone else's comfort. Over time, she learns to be careful not just with her actions, but with her instincts. And that caution, that constant editing, becomes fatigue, a kind of emotional exile. Even more insidious is how praise is often used as a form of control. You're so selfless. You're always calm. You're easy to be around. These compliments sound benign, even kind, but underneath them lies a warning. Stay this way, or risk losing approval. So the woman performs, sometimes beautifully, sometimes invisibly, until the performance becomes mistaken for her true self. What society represses, it teaches us to repress, and what it praises, we cling to, even when it doesn't feel true. When a culture elevates only fragments of a person, the rest doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. This is where the shadow begins to stir in sharper ways. Because no matter how deeply a woman hides her truth, it will find ways to surface, in conflict, in longing, in contradiction. In the next section, we'll explore how these repressed instincts reveal themselves, often in ways we least expect, and why understanding them is the first step toward integration. The shadow does not remain passive. What we repress eventually returns, not as a quiet whisper, but as a rupture. And the more thoroughly we deny a part of ourselves, the more urgently it demands expression. Often, this return is not graceful. A woman who has silenced her anger for years may find herself lashing out in moments that seem disproportionate, not because she is irrational, but because she has no safe place left to feel. A desire buried too long might erupt as obsession or fixation, not because the desire is wrong, but because it has been starving. The shadow, denied the light of conscious reflection, finds the back door. It seeps into relationships, work, even the body itself, through anxiety, exhaustion, or a persistent sense of being disconnected from one's life. Freud noticed this long before the language of trauma or repression became common. He observed how unconscious forces shape our behaviors, not with logic, but with emotional residue. What he called the return of the repressed wasn't merely symbolic, it was visceral. People reenact patterns they don't understand, attracted to situations that echo old pain, or sabotaging what they claim to want, not because they're broken, but because something inside them hasn't been witnessed. This is especially true for women raised to perform emotional caretaking. Many carry a hidden resentment they don't feel allowed to name. Others internalize guilt when they feel restless, unsatisfied, or ambitious. So the shadow wears disguises: passive aggression, perfectionism, overfunctioning. And behind each of these is often a buried truth, a need unspoken, a self unrevealed. But these symptoms are not failures. They are clues. They tell us where the wound lives and where the wholeness might begin. To see the shadow clearly is not to be defeated by it, but to realize that what we've labeled as dysfunction may actually be a form of resistance, a call to reclaim something vital. The next question, then, is how we move from avoidance to integration. How do we make space for the parts of ourselves we've learned to fear, not to indulge them, but to understand them? Let's explore that in the final section, how to walk toward the shadow and not away. To integrate the shadow is not to surrender to chaos. It is to step out of denial and into honesty. Integration asks us to hold space for what we once disowned, not with shame, but with curiosity. This is the beginning of wholeness, when we are no longer divided against ourselves. But the process is rarely comfortable. It begins, often, in small moments: a flash of jealousy, a sharp reaction, a sudden craving for something that feels out of character, rather than pushing it aside or explaining it away. Integration means pausing, asking gently, what part of me just spoke? What need has gone unmet? What truth have I avoided? This isn't self-indulgence, it's self-recognition. And for many women, it's profoundly disorienting at first, because they've been trained to filter their instincts through the lens of others' comfort. They're used to being good, agreeable, emotionally predictable. So when a deeper voice arises, one that is firm, wild, or unapologetically clear, the temptation is to silence it. But that voice, more often than not, is the shadow, and it does not come to destroy. It comes to restore. Psychologists like Jung believed that shadow integration requires conscious engagement. That might look like journaling when emotional patterns repeat, practicing active imagination, a method Jung taught to converse with inner figures, or working with a therapist who understands the symbolic dimension of the psyche. But the most important step is this: stop pretending that only your light defines you. There's power in saying, yes, I have rage. Yes, I have desire that doesn't fit the script. Yes, I long to be seen more fully, not just as helpful or gentle, but as whole. Integration does not mean acting out every emotion. It means acknowledging that these emotions exist. It means refusing to judge yourself by the categories others have used to control you. It means noticing when you're shrinking and asking why. For some, this path begins by reclaiming anger, not violence, but boundary. For others, it means learning to feel pleasure without apology, to say no without explanation, or to create without asking for permission. These aren't small shifts, they're revolutions, happening quietly, inside the self. And over time, something beautiful begins to emerge. You stop being afraid of your complexity. You stop needing to explain your contradictions. You begin to trust that you can hold both light and shadow, not as opposing forces, but as parts of a greater truth. Because wholeness isn't perfection, it's integration. It's choosing to belong to yourself, even when the world has taught you to fragment. So what part of you have you been told to hide? And what might change if, instead of pushing it deeper, you chose to listen, not with fear, but with compassion? Wholeness doesn't arrive all at once, but it begins the moment you decide to stop abandoning yourself. What we repress doesn't make us less human. It makes us incomplete. The shadow isn't a flaw in our design. It's the part of us that remembers who we were before we learned to hide. For women especially, living fully often means unlearning the silence. It means questioning praise that feels like confinement. It means becoming suspicious of comfort that costs authenticity. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be kind, or composed, or giving, but if those qualities are built on the burial of your truth, they are not virtues, they are masks. The journey toward the shadow is the journey back to self, not to what you should be, but to what you've always been, messy, feeling, whole. If something in this video stirred you, a memory, a feeling, or a part of yourself you haven't visited in a long time, I invite you to sit with it. You don't have to explain it, just notice. And if you found value here, let this be a space where we unlearn together. Like the video so others might find it too. Subscribe for more quiet explorations like this one. And tap the bell. Not just to stay connected, but to remind yourself there's nothing wrong with going deeper. What part of you is ready to return?